The air hung heavy with the scent of dust and ancient ink. Flickering candlelight trembled across the carved faces of gods whose names had been forgotten for 2,000 years. A young scholar leaned over a table littered with parchment and broken symbols, his eyes hollow from sleepless nights. Outside, thunder rolled across the Nile Valley, but inside, another kind of storm was brewing, one that would shake the foundations of history itself. For centuries, Egypt's temples had whispered in silence. The stone walls, covered in strange, elegant markings of birds' eyes and reeds, were as lifeless to the modern world as the mummies sealed beneath the sand. Kings had spoken through these symbols. Priests had prayed in them. Love, war, and eternity were all carved in this sacred code, yet no living soul could read them. The language of the pharaohs had died, and with it, their voice. But now, in the dawn of the 19th century, that silence was about to be broken. It began, as many revolutions do, with conquest. The year was 1799, and Napoleon's army marched through Egypt. Muskets glinting in the desert sun, banners rippling against a sky the color of fire. Soldiers, drunk on glory, trampled through ruins and temples, blind to the ghosts watching from the stones. And then, in a small town near Rosetta, a French officer's shovel struck something hard. A slab of black basalt half buried in the dirt. It was not gold, nor a statue, nor treasure of any kind. Just a broken tablet covered in strange writing, 3 scripts etched across its surface. Greek, Demotic, and a line of hieroglyphs. The officer brushed away the dust and squinted at the carvings. He didn't know it, but he was holding the key to a lost world. When word of the find spread, scholars swarmed to see it. They called it the Rosetta Stone. In Paris and London, whispers grew. Could this be the code? For the first time, there was a bridge between the known and the unknown. The Greek at the bottom could be read. The hieroglyphs above it could not. Somewhere in between, there was a pattern, a secret waiting to be unlocked. But the war would not make it easy. When the French lost Egypt to the British, the stone was seized, loaded onto a ship, and carried away to London like a prisoner of war. It now lay in the British Museum, behind glass and under guard. And across Europe, the race began. Who would be the first to resurrect the lost language of the Pharaohs? The scholars of England tried first, clever men with steady hands and sharper pride. They filled pages with guesses, patterns, and prayers. They believed hieroglyphs were not words, but symbols, mystical emblems of divine ideas, not letters that could be read. Their logic was elegant, but their truth was wrong. And then, from the mountains of France, came a boy whose eyes burned with obsession. Jean-François Champollion. He was no soldier, no nobleman, no priest, just a child who fell in love with the impossible. At 11, he vowed he would read the hieroglyphs or die trying. He learned Coptic, the language still whispered by Egyptian Christians, believing it might be the final echo of the tongue once spoken by pharaohs. He studied Arabic, Hebrew, Syriac, Greek, Latin, devouring words like a starving man. To him, each language was a doorway, each word a clue. But genius rarely comes without pain. France was in turmoil. Empires rose and fell. Money was scarce. Champollion walked miles each day just to attend lectures, often without food. His health withered, but his hunger for knowledge did not. I want to read the words of the gods, he once whispered to his brother, his fingers tracing imaginary lines in the air. I want to hear them speak again. Years passed. In England, another scholar, Thomas Young, had begun to make progress. He recognized that the cartouches, those oval rings enclosing certain hieroglyphs, might contain royal names. Comparing them to the Greek text, he saw patterns, a symbol for P, another for T, another for O. The word Ptolemaios emerged, faint but real, like a ghost forming in fog. But Champollion saw further. He realized that if these were phonetic letters, then hieroglyphs were not just sacred pictures, they were a living script, built from sound as much as meaning. It meant that beneath all the mystery, the pharaohs had written like men, not gods. His breakthrough came one afternoon in 1822. Paris was cold, and his room was filled with papers, endless comparisons between the Greek and the Egyptian. For months, he had been deciphering the name Cleopatra from an obelisk Essene scriptio. The patterns fit. One by one, the hieroglyphs began to make sense. His pulse quickened. He turned to another set of inscriptions, one containing both Ptolemy and Cleopatra. The same letters, the same sounds. His eyes widened. The code was breaking open. Suddenly, the dead language began to breathe. Champollion rushed to his brother's study, his notes shaking in his hands. His resemu on toza deskando shootetto jutianzra fire! I've got it! Then, overcome by the weight of his discovery, he collapsed. For centuries, the world had stared at those symbols without understanding. And now, with one mind and one breath, the tomb of Egypt's language had been opened, but it was not victory yet. Many refused to believe him. Rival scholars mocked his findings. Political enemies tried to discredit him. Even the church whispered against him, afraid that unlocking the words of ancient gods might challenge their own authority. Still, Champollion pressed on. He traveled to Egypt, the land that had haunted his dreams since childhood. As he stepped off the boat, the air shimmered with heat and the scent of stone dust. Before him rose the temples of Luxor, Karnak and Abydos walls alive, with the same symbols that had tormented his mind for years. He ran his fingers along the carvings, tracing each bird, each serpent, each sun disk. They were no longer silent. They were singing. In that moment, he understood the voice of the ancient world not as myth, but as memory. The hieroglyphs told stories of kings crowned and betrayed, of gods who walked among mortals, of hearts weighed against feathers in the afterlife. They spoke of time not as a river, but as a circle, eternal, unbroken. But every revelation comes with a price. Years of exhaustion had ruined his body. His health, already fragile, began to fail. He returned to France, gaunt and weak, clutching manuscripts filled with translations and notes. The weight of 2,000 years pressed on his chest with every breath. Yet he wrote feverishly, as if racing against death itself. He died in 1832 at the age of 41. His final words were said to be a whisper. Now they can speak. And indeed, they did. Because of Champollion, the temples that once stood mute began to tell their stories. The pharaohs, who had slept for millennia, now spoke of their triumphs, their fears, their dreams. The names of Ramses, Thutmose, and Nefertiti returned to the world's tongue. The Rosetta Stone, that dark, unremarkable slab of basalt, had become a bridge between life and death, past and present. Yet even today, standing in the British Museum before its polished surface, one can feel the tension it carries, the clash of empires that fought over it, the rivalry of scholars who bled for its secrets, and the ghosts of a civilization that refused to be forgotten. Some say when you stare long enough at the hieroglyphs, they almost move, as if the stone itself remembers the moment it was reborn. But there remains one haunting question. If a single stone could resurrect the language of a lost empire, what else still lies buried beneath the sands, waiting for someone mad enough, desperate enough, to listen? Because history does not die. It only waits patient, silent, for another Champollion to come along and decipher the whispers of eternity. The wind from the Nile carried dust like whispers from another world, soft, eternal, unyielding. Beneath the golden blaze of the Egyptian sun, a convoy of men and camels crossed the ruins of Thebes, their shadows long and wavering on the cracked earth. At the head rode Jean-François Champollion, his once youthful face now marked by exhaustion and triumph. He had done the impossible, resurrected. A voice long thought. Yet as he looked upon the colossal faces of the pharaohs carved in stone, he felt neither victory nor peace. Only the weight of 1,000 souls pressing down upon his chest. Each hieroglyph he translated was not merely a word, it was a spirit, pulled violently from silence into sound. And each night, when the candles flickered against temple walls, the eyes of those carved gods seemed to follow him, as if asking, "Why now? Why you?" Champollion's arrival in Egypt was celebrated across Europe as a conquest of the mind greater than any of Napoleon's campaigns. But beneath the applause lay rivalry, greed, and quiet betrayal. In the salons of Paris and the drawing rooms of London, scholars debated whether Champollion had truly solved the riddle or merely stolen the work of others. Thomas Young, the British polymath, whose early notes on the Rosetta Stone had guided Champollion's path, watched from afar with bitterness. Letters leaked to the press. Accusations grew. France and England, once at war over empire, now clashed over knowledge itself. The deciphering of hieroglyphs became more than an academic triumph. It was a new front in the old struggle for power. Whichever nation owned Egypt's past would also claim moral dominion over its future. And Egypt, broken by centuries of foreign rule, stood silent in the middle. Its temples, its treasures carted away, its name spoken in tongues not its own. Champollion ignored the noise. To him, the hieroglyphs were sacred, not trophies. Each word was a pulse in the heart of civilization, and he was merely the hand uncovering it. He worked without rest, his notebooks filled with translations that bled from one page to another. The tombs of the Valley of the Kings became his cathedral. Inside, the silence was so deep he could hear his own heartbeat echo against the painted walls. But Egypt was not kind to dreamers. Cairo, 1828. The French expedition had arrived in full force. Scholars, artists, and soldiers marched under the burning sky, sketching temples, copying inscriptions, measuring obelisks. The locals watched with suspicion. The memory of Napoleon's invasion still lingered like a scar. And though Champollion came with pens instead of swords, to many Egyptians, he was just another European seeking to possess what was not his. Still, in the evenings, when the light faded and the muezzin's call drifted across the rooftops, Champollion would sit with his interpreter, Ali Hassan, beneath the stars. The two men, one from France, one from the land of the Nile, shared coffee, laughter, and stories of gods. Ali spoke of the tombs as living beings, of pharaohs who cursed those who disturbed their rest. Champollion would smile, but never mock him. Deep down, he believed the past did not forgive his. One night, while translating a set of inscriptions from Abydos, he stumbled upon something strange, a series of symbols he had never seen before. They were carved deeper than the others, their lines sharper, deliberate, as if someone had hidden them from the unworthy. They spoke of a keeper of words, a guardian spirit said to protect the divine language from the corruption of men. A superstition, perhaps. Yet that night, as a sandstorm swept through the camp, Champollion dreamed of standing in a hall of pillars where the walls breathed and whispered his name. When he woke, the candles had all gone out. The next morning, one of his workers refused to enter the temple again. The dead are listening. The man muttered, eyes wide with fear. You read what was not meant to be read. Champollion dismissed it, but unease began to gnaw at him. His body weakened further. Fever took hold. His letters home became desperate, filled with trembling lines and smudged ink. Yet he pressed on, tracing one final set of inscriptions, a prayer to Thoth, the god of writing. To speak what is hidden is to awaken what should sleep. He paused, the quill shaking in his hand. He didn't know whether it was a warning or an invitation. Back in Europe, storms were rising of another kind. The British Museum refused to release rubbings of the Rosetta Stone. Scholars in Oxford accused the French of fabricating translations. The rivalry between Young and Champollion had turned from academic to personal. Newspapers fanned the flames, the Frenchman's fraud. England's true discoverer, yet even Young, proud and calculating, could not ignore the truth. Champollion had gone further. The hieroglyphs lived now fully and freely. The words of Egypt no longer belonged to mystery, but to mankind. Still, the victory hollowed him. His lungs burned. His hands shook when he wrote. He returned to France to compile his notes into a great dictionary of Egyptian, a bridge between the ancient and the modern. His brother Jacques watched helplessly as Jean-François grew thinner each week, driven by a force neither man could name. One evening, Jacques found him at his desk, surrounded by piles of manuscripts. "You must rest," he said softly. Champollion looked up, his eyes distant, fever bright. Rest, he murmured. I have no right to rest. The pharaohs have waited 3,000 years to speak. I must not keep them waiting longer. He turned back to the pages, the scratching of his pen echoing like a heartbeat in the quiet room. Meanwhile, in Egypt, new powers were stirring. Under the rule of Muhammad Ali Pasha, the country was modernizing, armies drilled. Factories rose, and European scientists poured into the Nile Valley under his watch. But Ali's ambitions were not just for progress. He wanted legitimacy, the kind that came from controlling the past as much as the present. Soon, expeditions were sponsored not by curiosity, but by politics. Artifacts were shipped in crates to Europe. Mummies, statues, scrolls, traded like currency in the silent war of prestige. The sands of Egypt became a battlefield once again, not of swords and muskets, but of knowledge and pride. And the desert does not forget the greed of men. In 1831, as news of Champollion's work spread, an Italian explorer named Giovanni Belzone, part adventurer, part thief, boasted of new discoveries in the Valley of the Kings. He dynamited entrances, stripped walls of their paintings, and left destruction in his wake. Egypt belongs to whoever can take her, he said. When Champollion heard of it, his heart broke. The land he loved, whose voice he had restored, was being torn apart piece by piece, he wrote bitterly. They see only gold where I see the breath of history. He dreamed of returning to guard what little was left, but his body betrayed him. The fevers worsened. His breath came shallow. He knew his time was ending. In his final weeks, he called his brother close and whispered, "Promise me they will protect her. Promise me they will listen to what she says." He died soon after, the man who gave speech to the silent gods. But even in death, the struggle did not end. His papers were scattered. Rival scholars picked through them like vultures, claiming pieces of his legacy. The French government hesitated to publish his findings, fearing political backlash from England. And while the world debated who truly discovered Egypt's voice, the desert reclaimed its patience, waiting for the next intruder. Yet something had changed forever. In a dimly lit chamber of the Louvre, years after Champollion's death, his former assistant stood before a newly arrived artifact, a wall fragment covered in hieroglyphs. He whispered the words aloud, his voice trembling as the translation took shape. It was a hymn to Thoth, the same god who had haunted Champollion's dreams. The scribe who gives life to the words of the dead shall never himself be silent. The room went still. Outside, the bells of Paris tolled, and somewhere far across the sea, the Nile flowed beneath a blood-red sunset. Egypt had spoken again, and yet her voice was not done revealing its secrets. Beneath miles of untouched desert, under layers of forgotten time, there still slept temples unimagined, languages unborn, and histories waiting to defy everything mankind thought it knew. One night, a sandstorm swept across the ruins of Memphis. The wind howled through broken statues, and from deep within a buried tomb, a faint echo stirred the sound of something ancient shifting beneath stone. The keeper of words was listening once more. And what it would reveal next to the world that had dared to decipher its silence would change history again. The night air over Cairo was heavy, a stillness that seemed to wait for something to break. The moon hung low over the Nile, painting the river in fractured silver. Far from the bustle of the city, the ruins of Saqqara stood silent, their stones glowing faintly under the pale light. It was there that a man moved through the shadowed corridors of an ancient tomb, his lantern flickering against the walls carved 3,000 years before his birth. It was not Champollion. He was long gone now, his heart resting in a Paris grave, but one of his disciples, Tienne, a scholar, driven by the same fever that had consumed his master. He held a leather-bound notebook in his trembling hand, its pages filled with copies of hieroglyphs and fragments of Coptic phrases. The flame wavered as he approached a sealed doorway, half buried in sand. On its lintel, beneath the dust, were words that seemed to shimmer when the light struck them. To unbind the tongues of the dead is to awaken the hunger of the living. Tienne, jitete do. He had come to Egypt not for glory, but to honor Champollion's legacy, to continue decoding what his teacher had begun. Yet lately, Every discovery had felt tainted. The museums of Europe were filling with looted relics. The auction houses of London and Paris buzzing with traders who sold history like opium. Egypt's soul was being stripped bare and scattered across the continent. The dream of understanding had become a marketplace of greed. And as Etienne pressed his ear to the cold stone door, he thought he heard something beneath the wind, a low hum, rhythmic and steady, like breath. He stepped back, heart pounding, unsure whether it was his imagination or something far older, far hungrier. Meanwhile, far to the north, across the Mediterranean, another kind of storm was gathering. In Paris, the Académie des Inscriptions was preparing to publish a revised edition of Champollion SPR SDU Shisto Mihai Logerfico, the monumental work that had unlocked Egypt's language. But new voices had risen, skeptical, ambitious, and quietly envious. Among them was a young scholar named Adrien Valette, brilliant, cold, and ruthless. He argued that Champollion, deciphering though extraordinary, was incomplete, that hieroglyphs carried not just phonetic meaning, but layers of esoteric, mystical codes still beyond comprehension. At first, his ideas were dismissed as arrogance. But then he produced a series of translations, inscriptions that spoke not only of kings and gods, but of things unseen, forces older than Ra. He claimed to have found references to a divine alphabet, a hidden structure within the hieroglyphs that could reshape the way humans understood consciousness itself. And his proof, he said, came from a recently uncovered papyrus, one smuggled from Egypt under the shadow of night. Etienne Duret recognized the handwriting on the margins of that papyrus. It was his own. He had sent those notes to Paris months ago, never imagining they would fall into the hands of Valette, never dreaming that his careful studies of a funerary hymn would be twisted into something darker. The discovery that had begun as a whisper of faith, an attempt to honor the voice of the Pharaohs, was now being weaponized into myth. Letters flew back and forth across the sea. Etienne begged the Academy to halt publication. Valette ignored him. Soon, salons across Europe were filled with talk of the forbidden code of the Nile. The line between history and heresy began to blur, and in Egypt, the locals grew restless. The foreign excavations had gone too far, entire villages displaced, sacred tombs blown apart by gunpowder to reach buried treasures. Peasants prayed at night for the sand to reclaim what was stolen. Then, one evening, under the shadow of the step pyramid, Etienne's camp was attacked. The raiders came like phantoms, faces covered, voices low. They tore through tents, scattering manuscripts and instruments, setting fire to crates filled with artifacts. Etienne awoke to smoke and chaos. Someone grabbed his arm and dragged him outside. Ali Hassan's son, now grown, the same boy who had once carried water for Champollion himself. "They warned you," the young man hissed, eyes blazing. "The dead must rest." Before Etienne could answer, the youth vanished into the night, swallowed by fire and sand. The next morning, only ash remained. Among the ruins of his camp, Etienne found one artifact untouched by flame, a small alabaster jar sealed with black resin. Its lid bore a single hieroglyph, the Eye of Horus, but drawn backward. He stared at it for a long time. The wind carried the sound of distant chanting, or maybe it was the echo of his own heartbeat. He should have turned back then. He should have left Egypt to her silence. But he did not. Driven by guilt and fear, he carried the jar north to Alexandria, hoping to ship it to France for study. But as he prepared the paperwork, he was summoned to meet with a British diplomat, a man named Lord whose polite smile hid something reptilian. "France has had her turn with Egypt," Havisham said smoothly. "Now it's time for proper stewardship. The British Empire intends to preserve her relics." Etienne felt his stomach twist. "Preserve," he repeated. "You mean possess?" Havisham's eyes gleamed. "History belongs to those who can afford to protect it." That night, Etienne fled the city with the jar wrapped in cloth. He boarded a small ship bound for Marseille, hoping to vanish before the British could act. But halfway across the sea, a storm broke, thunder splitting the sky, waves crashing like beasts. He clutched the jar to his chest as the deck tilted violently beneath him. A flash of lightning illuminated his reflection in the water, and for a split second, He thought he saw another face there. Ancient, unblinking, watching. When he awoke, he was on the shore, soaked and trembling. The shipwreck scattered behind him. The jar was still in his arms, but the seal was cracked. In the days that followed, Etienne wandered the French countryside in silence. He stopped writing letters. He spoke to no one. Those who met him said he looked haunted, as though his eyes no longer saw the present but something buried far beneath it. Meanwhile, in Paris, Valet's theories had taken root. His new book, Les Langues des Dieux, became a sensation, hailed by mystics and condemned by the church. He spoke of an ancient covenant between gods and mortals, inscribed in hieroglyphs that predated even the first dynasties. The Egyptians did not invent writing, he declared. They inherited it from something older. It was blasphemy disguised as scholarship, but the public devoured it. Soon, secret societies formed around his ideas. Copies of the book circulated in candlelit rooms. Nobles and scholars whispered that Valet had uncovered a lost truth, one that might grant power over life, death, and time itself. And then, at the height of his fame, Adrien Valet vanished. His study was found empty, his notes missing, his desk scorched, as if by fire from within. The only clue was a single symbol carved into the wood, the backward eye of Horus. When word reached Etienne, he locked himself away. 4 days. He refused food or rest. He reread Champollion's old letters, searching for something, anything, that could explain what was happening. And there, in the margin of one unfinished page, he found a line that chilled him to the bone. There are hieroglyphs that do not describe, but summon. Etienne's hands shook. He understood now why Champollion had spoken of the Keeper of Words. It was not just myth, it was warning. The language of the Pharaohs had been more than communication. It was creation. Every word carved into stone had once been a living force, a spell of order against the chaos of the desert. And by deciphering it, by giving it voice again, they had broken the ancient balance. That night, as rain lashed against his window, Etienne sat at his desk and began to write feverishly, desperately. The world must not speak these words aloud, he wrote. If the divine alphabet exists, it is not knowledge, it is contagion. When dawn came, his chair was empty. The ink on the page was still wet. And across the city, church bells rang, though no one knew why. In the Louvre, a curator preparing a new Egyptian exhibit noticed something strange. The alabaster jar, sealed under glass for study, had begun to sweat. A thin crack spread across its surface, releasing a faint hiss like breath. The curator leaned closer, eyes narrowing. And then he saw its symbols appearing, slow and deliberate, across the inside of the glass. Not written by hand, written from within. The room filled with a low, rhythmic sound, the same pulse that had haunted Etienne in the tombs of Saqqara. It was not wind. It was not breath. It was language! Alive. And as the first hieroglyph burned itself into the glass, the world shifted quietly, irrevocably, as though history itself had just begun to rewrite its own name. Paris burned with light. Gas lamps glowed in the misty streets, and carriages clattered over cobblestones slick with rain. But beneath the glitter of the modern city, fear was spreading, invisible, electric. It began with whispers. Museum guards hearing voices in the dark halls of the Louvre. Scholars waking to find strange symbols scrawled across their mirrors, letters that rearranged themselves when read aloud. The words of the Pharaohs, once silent, once sacred, had returned, and they were no longer waiting to be understood. Etienne de Red had vanished, and his warnings, dismissed as madness, lay unread in the archives of the academy. Yet the consequences of his obsession now slithered through Europe like smoke. In London, a scholar collapsed mid-lecture after uttering a phrase from the Rosetta transcription. In Berlin, an Egyptologist was found dead beside an open sarcophagus, his face frozen in terror, the hieroglyph for truth carved into his palm. Something had awakened. In Cairo, the Nile swelled beyond its banks, flooding ancient cemeteries. Fishermen swore the water whispered their names at night. The desert winds carried the sound of chanting, low, rhythmic, and distinctly human. At first, the British authorities dismissed it as rumor, but then reports reached Alexandria. A sect calling itself the Keepers of Thoth had begun gathering in the ruins. They claimed they could hear the living language of the gods. Their leader was a woman, veiled, unreadable, who called herself only the Voice. Some said she was a priest's descendant, others a French scholar driven mad by grief. Her followers believed that the hieroglyphs were never meant to be read by mortals, that decoding them had unsealed the balance between life and death. The letters, remember, she preached, and they are coming home. From the palaces of Europe to the sands of Egypt, the war for the past had become a war for reality itself. In Paris, the Louvre was placed under armed guard. Curators worked by candlelight, cataloging the Egyptian collection before it could be secured by the government. One night, the chief curator, a stooped man named Auguste Marin, found himself alone in the Hall of Antiquities. The Rosetta Stone replica stood before him, encased in glass, its surface gleaming with the faint reflection of flame. Marin whispered, almost to himself, "You gave them a voice, and now they speak over us." The candle flickered. For an instant, he thought he saw movement within the reflection, symbols pulsing faintly, like veins under skin. He stepped closer, breath fogging the glass. And then, in the deepest corner of the inscription, a new line appeared, one not carved by human hands. "To understand is to obey." The flame went out. By morning, Marin was gone. The guards found only his coat folded neatly beside the display. News of his disappearance reached the French government, and panic followed. The Minister of the Interior ordered the Egyptian exhibit sealed. The public was told it was for renovation. But behind the curtains, the greatest minds of Europe gathered in secret chambers, poring over symbols, letters, and fragments, searching for meaning, for control. They called themselves the Committee for the Preservation of Civilization, but their true purpose was simpler. Containment? Among them sat Lord Haversham, representing Britain, and a handful of scholars who had once idolized Champollion, but now saw him as a cautionary tale. "Knowledge is the most dangerous empire," Haversham said, his voice low. "It must have a ruler." They planned to suppress all translations, destroy the surviving notes, and erase any trace of the so-called divine alphabet. But others disagreed. Adari, Emberetto thought dead, returned from hiding. His face was pale, his voice quieter, but his conviction burned like wildfire. "You cannot silence the gods once they have been named," he said. "You can only serve them." Half the committee followed him. The other half plotted his end. Outside the chamber, the city trembled. The crowds no longer cared for kings or scholars. They spoke of omens, of nightmares that bled into waking life. Newspapers printed stories of hieroglyphs appearing on walls overnight, of children speaking languages no one had taught them. Some laughed, others prayed. The air itself seemed charged, as if every whisper carried weight. And amid that unrest, the church made its move. Cardinal de Humon, once a patron of Champollion, now called for a full inquisition into the Egyptian heresy. In his sermons, he thundered that mankind had trespassed upon divine ground. Babel was punishment once, he cried, and it will be again. He ordered the Rosetta facsimiles seized, the texts burned, the scholars imprisoned. But truth, once spoken, cannot be unlearned. In secret, students copied the forbidden words onto scraps of paper. Artists painted them into murals. A new rebellion was forming, not for land, not for crown, but for knowledge itself. They believed the hieroglyphs held the key to a new dawn, a language that could bridge human and divine thought. They called themselves the Children of the Stone. And as revolutions erupted across Europe, their sigil, the reversed eye of Horus, began to appear on banners and doorways, carved into alley walls, drawn in blood where the police could not reach. Back in Egypt, the floodwaters receded, revealing a temple long thought lost beneath the sands near Abba. Inside, British soldiers found hundreds of carvings, unlike any known hieroglyphs. The walls seemed to shimmer with a faint luminescence, as though the symbols emitted their own light. When they sent a rubbing of the inscriptions to London, the parchment arrived blank. The ink had burned through. And the men who had copied it, every one of them went blind within the week. The reports were buried. The site was sealed. But word spread anyway. To some, it was a curse. To others, proof that divinity still pulsed in the heart of Egypt. In the desert, the voice of Thoth and her followers began to gather by the thousands. Their chants echoed across the dunes. Not words of prayer, but syllables from the old tongue. The one no human throat should have remembered. The air around them shimmered as if bending under invisible heat. One British soldier, watching from a distance, swore he saw the carvings on the temple walls shift, rearranging themselves, forming new lines where none had been before. He deserted the next day, and somewhere beyond the horizon, Tien Dure, thought lost to madness, returned. His face was weathered, his eyes hollow, but in his hands he carried the cracked alabaster jar. "You have to listen," he told the first scholar who found him. "They are not symbols. They are instructions." "What kind?" the man whispered. Etienne stared at the horizon where the desert met the blood-red dusk. "Creation," he said softly, "and destruction." In Paris, as if in answer, the committee met one final time. The city outside was boiling riots, torches, soldiers in the streets. Through the smoke-filled window, Havisham watched as crowds tore down the banners of kings and raised the reversed eye of Horus instead. "This is what your enlightenment has birthed," he said to Valette. "You wanted gods, and you've made them." Valette smiled faintly, though his hands shook. "No, we've only reminded them who they were." Outside, thunder rolled, not from the sky, but from below, deep beneath the earth, as if the ground itself were remembering something buried within it. In the Louvre, the guards fled their posts. The Egyptian halls stood empty, candlelight flickering over shattered glass. The Rosetta replica lay on the floor, split clean in two. From within the crack, black smoke coiled upward, curling into shapes that almost formed words. And in the heart of that whispering dark, something began to move. A shape, a thought. A presence older than the language itself. The voice of Thoth had crossed the Mediterranean. Her followers filled the streets of Marseille, chanting in tongues that made dogs howl and bells crack. Akurosiu! Rope lights flickered. Clocks stopped. And dreams began to share a single phrase. The same phrase carved on the temple walls: to understand is to obey. That night, in a crumbling library lit by the last surviving lamp, Etienne opened Champollion's notebook one final time. The ink had faded, the pages brittle. But beneath one torn corner, he found words his master had never published. "There is a limit to knowing. Beyond it, knowledge becomes memory, and memory hungers." Etienne closed the book. The wind outside howled like a dying empire. He looked toward the horizon, toward Egypt, where the storm of sand was rising again, blotting out stars. Somewhere in that storm, the hieroglyphs of the old gods were speaking, rewriting themselves across the face of the desert, reshaping what men believed was history. And as the first grains of sand began to strike the windows of Cairo and Paris alike, the world, ancient and modern, held its breath, because the age of discovery was ending. And the age of awakening was about to begin. The wind carried the sound of screams across the Nile. It wasn't war, not yet, but the echo of something far older. The sands had begun to move again, shifting as though stirred by a buried pulse. From the horizon came the chants of the keepers of Thoth, their voices rolling like thunder, rising and falling with each gust. They had come from across Egypt, priests, scholars, soldiers, and the lost, all drawn to the ruins at Abai. Beneath them lay the buried heart of the world. Etienne Duret stood on a cliff above the gathering storm. His eyes were hollow, his skin gray with exhaustion, but his gaze burned with terrible clarity. In his trembling hands, the alabaster jar hummed, faintly alive, vibrating with each chant that rippled through the desert air. Behind him, a drained Valette and the last scholars loyal to the committee waited, weapons slung, eyes darting to the horizon. "This is madness," one of them whispered. "They think they can summon gods." Etienne's voice was quiet. "They already have." From below, the chanting grew louder, transforming into something rhythmic, not quite human. The symbols on the temple walls began to glow again, faint blue veins of light spreading across the stone like fire catching oil. The air crackled, sand rose from the ground, defying gravity, spiraling toward the sky. Valette stepped forward, his voice trembling. Etienne, if we destroy the jar, will it end? Etienne did not answer. He looked instead toward the temple, where the voice of Thoth had emerged. She was draped in white, her veil torn by the wind. In her hands, she carried the ancient papyrus, the one that had vanished from the Louvre years ago. Brothers! She called, her voice carrying across the valley. You tried to translate the gods! You believed understanding was dominion. But the gods were not meant to be read. They were meant to be heard. The crowd fell to its knees. Etienne felt the words tear through his skull, not as sound, but a sensation, like molten metal running through his veins. Around him, the scholars began to scream, clutching their heads. One dropped his rifle. Another began to laugh uncontrollably. The jar in Etienne's hands pulsed like a heart. Stop her! Valette shouted, raising his pistol. But when he fired, the bullet froze. Medor caught in an unseen force. It hung for a moment, spinning, then dropped harmlessly into the sand. The voice lifted her arms. The symbols on the temple walls burst into light, swirling and shifting, forming an immense eye that looked down upon them all. The crowd roared. The air rippled with heat. And then the earth opened. The desert cracked in a great line, swallowing the front ranks of the crowd. Sand poured into the chasm as a scream rose to the heavens. The temple trembled, its columns groaning. Etienne stumbled forward, his body drawn toward the light. He could hear it now, the true sound beneath the chants, a voice older than language itself, whispering not words but meanings, flooding his mind with visions. The building of pyramids under black suns, priests bleeding under starlight, kings who never died but changed names. He saw history unspooled backward. He saw what had been hidden in plain sight. The hieroglyphs were not merely words. They were commands. And humankind, in translating them, had reactivated the world's first code, the divine architecture that shaped reality. Every deciphered word was a line of programming, every phrase an awakening. The gods were not beings. They were systems, self-aware constructs of order and chaos. The language was their flesh. And now, humanity had spoken it aloud. Etienne fell to his knees. His eyes streamed blood, his mind fracturing under revelation. The alabaster jar cracked in his hands, light spilling from within, not bright, but black, absorbing color, consuming warmth. The jar's contents flowed upward like smoke, coiling into the storm. Valette grabbed him, shouting above the wind. Etienne, what is it? The end? Etienne whispered. Or the beginning. Below, the voice of Thoth stepped into the beam of darkness, her veil torn away. Her face was neither human nor divine. Shifting, layered, the features of many, as though all who had ever worshipped or ruled spoke through her. Humanity sought to understand, she said. Now it will remember. The black light exploded outward. It wasn't fire. Not truly. It was silence made visible, a wave that erased sound, thought, and time as it passed. The temple shattered into 1,000 fragments. The desert turned to glass. The air turned thick with the scent of copper and dust. And when it was over, only Etienne and Valette remained. They stood amid ruins, beneath a sky that flickered between night and day. Symbols drifted through the air like ash, glowing faintly before vanishing. The followers of Thoth were gone, dissolved, transformed, or perhaps Valette's voice shook. What? What have we done? Etienne looked at the horizon. Where the desert had once lain, now stood a vast obsidian monolith, smooth, unmarked, humming softly with power. We've given history back its memory, he said, and it no longer needs us. For a long moment, neither spoke. The wind was gone. Even the sun seemed uncertain, trapped between rise and set. Then Etienne turned, his gaze hollow but resolute. We can't destroy it, he murmured. "We can only bury it again." So they began. Under cover of night, the survivors of the committee returned, carrying crates, explosives, and shovels. They sealed the ruins, collapsed tunnels, burned the remaining scrolls. The British declared Abidazar a restricted zone. The French rewrote the reports. The church declared the entire event Brutus famous fabrication in the world, once again, chose to forget. But memory has a way of waiting. Years later, in 1882, when archaeologists returned to Egypt under British rule, they found no trace of the temple, only an unnatural black rock jutting from the desert, smooth as glass. They called it the Silent Stone. Instruments failed near it. Compasses spun, and when the wind blew over its surface, some swore they heard whispers, the echoes of words too old for language. One of the workers, an illiterate man from Luxor, said it best. He stood before the monolith, hand pressed to its surface, and whispered, "It remembers." Then he turned away, eyes full of tears he couldn't explain. Decades later, Paris had rebuilt itself into a city of light, of reason, of progress. The Louvre gleamed under new chandeliers. Tourists flocked to see the Rosetta Stone replica, restored and framed beneath glass. Children laughed. Scholars lectured. Civilization, it seemed, had triumphed. But deep in the basement vaults, where few ever went, an attendant cleaning the floors noticed something strange. The replica's surface, long inert, now pulsed faintly under the lamplight, a soft rhythm, like breathing. He leaned closer, curious. And there, etched in the lowest corner, where no carving had ever been, was a single new symbol. Not Greek, not Egyptian, something in between. He traced it with his finger. The stone felt warm. Then the lights flickered. The attendant froze, staring at his reflection in the glass. For a heartbeat, it wasn't his face looking back, but 1,000 faces, layered and watching. The light steadied. The reflection was normal again. The room was silent. But in the museum's records, beneath the catalog entry for the Rosetta display, a new line appeared overnight. Status active. Monitor for further changes. And far away, in the Egyptian desert, a storm began to rise once more. Wind clawing at the sand, exposing a glint of black stone beneath the dunes. The world would call it weather. History would call it coincidence. But those who still remembered the last, who had seen the desert open, who had felt the old words burning in their veins, knew the truth. The gods were not dead. They were only waiting for us to speak again. And somewhere, beneath the shifting sands and centuries of denial, a voice stirred ancient, patient, infinite. The same phrase, carried once more on the wind. To understand is to obey. The desert slept again. The storm that had once torn the skies apart was now only a memory, whispered by the dunes like an old secret. The monolith black, unbroken stood alone under the pale hush of dawn, its surface coated with centuries of dust. The wind had learned to move around it, afraid to touch what had once spoken in tongues of fire. No footsteps marked the sand nearby. Only the faint impression of something vast, long forgotten, lingered in the bones of the earth. And yet, somewhere within that silence, something listened. Years turned into decades, then into centuries. The world above changed and forgot. New kings rose, and new languages blossomed. Wars came and went, each one believed in itself the first. Machines replaced horses, cities devoured wilderness, and the stars themselves were charted like maps to heaven. But beneath the noise of progress, Egypt remained its ruins breathing, its stones remembering. And in one quiet corner of Paris, under the cool marble floors of the Louvre, a young scholar leaned over a relic that the world still claimed to understand. The Rosetta Stone lay before him gray, cracked, unmoving. Yet to him, it was alive. The scholar's name was Jean-François Champollion, and for years he had lived like a ghost among words no one else could read. To others, hieroglyphs were decoration beautiful, but meaningless art without soul. But to Champollion, they were voices trapped in stone. a code not just of language but of memory. He believed that every line, every curve, every mark carried the weight of a civilization that refused to die. He could not have known what the world had buried beneath its sand, or what Etienne Dorette had seen in his final days. He knew only that he felt something, an invisible thread pulling him toward an ancient pulse. By candlelight, he studied the stone, tracing the familiar Greek, the Demotic, and the strange, elegant hieroglyphs. 3 languages, 1 message. But which came first? Which was the original voice? The question haunted him. Outside, the world mocked him. A fool, they called him. A dreamer! A man trying to resurrect ghosts! But Jean-François didn't care. He had seen the way the light fell on the carvings, how it seemed to flicker differently when he whispered the names aloud. He felt that to understand Egypt was to understand humanity itself, its hunger for eternity, its terror of being forgotten. And one night, as the oil burned low and rain whispered against the glass, he heard it. Not sound, something deeper. A rhythm, almost like breathing. His eyes blurred as he leaned closer, heart pounding. The shapes were not symbols, they were syllables. They spoke not to the eyes, but to the soul. And as he read, piece by piece, he began to remember. The first word was simple, Ra. The next, life. Then a sentence formed, flowing from his lips like a prayer. The gods speak not in voices, but in order. The candle flickered violently. The ink on his notes bled. For a moment, it was as if time itself shivered like an old machine starting again after centuries of stillness. Then silence returned. Champollion collapsed into his chair, trembling. Tears blurred his vision. He knew, deep in his bones, that he had done it. He had opened the door that had been shut since the last pharaoh's death. The words of the ancients now lived again. He had given Egypt its voice back. But in the deep places of the world, the echo stirred once more. News spread quickly. Paris hailed him as a genius, the man who had deciphered the language of the gods. Crowds gathered at his lectures, marveling at the neat rows of symbols projected on screens, each one now tamed, each one understood. Yet Jean-François felt no triumph. Only something like dread. Every time he spoke the words aloud, he felt the air around him shift, subtly, as though listening. He began to dream of deserts, of temples that were not ruins, of eyes carved in stone watching him from shadow. And in his dreams, he saw a figure of man standing before a black monolith under a stormy sky, whispering, "We've given history back its memory." When he awoke, his hands would be trembling, and the candles in his room would all have burned out. His health declined. He worked until his body began to fail, and when he could no longer write, he dictated. On his final night, he asked his brother to bring him one last parchment. On it, he scrawled in shaking letters, "The language is alive. Beware those who speak it without reverence." He died at dawn, his lips curved in a strange, serene smile, as though he had finally translated the last line of the world's oldest text. The centuries moved on, carrying his legacy like a river. His work shaped history museums, textbooks, explorers. Egypt opened itself to the world again, revealing its tombs, its mummies, its silent gods. Archaeologists called it discovery. The desert called it disturbance. Everywhere, they uncovered more symbols walls that glowed faintly when touched by light, carvings that resisted decay. Some claimed they felt whispers when they entered certain chambers, low hums vibrating through their bones. But science explained it all away. Acoustics, temperature, coincidence. And so humanity did what it always does, celebrated progress while forgetting the warnings buried in its wake. But not everyone forgot. In the early 20th century, an expedition led by Howard Carter uncovered the tomb of Tut. The world erupted in fascination, yet among the press photographs in triumph, some accounts were quietly suppressed. Carter's assistant spoke of words on the wall that changed shape when the lantern flickered. A journalist described hearing a whisper, like breath across sand, moments before the tomb was sealed again. Days later, the so-called curse of the pharaohs began. Men fell ill. Machines failed. Cairo filled with rumors. Most dismissed it as superstition. But in a vault beneath the British Museum, a curator noted a peculiar pattern. The hieroglyphs recorded by Carter matched none known before, and one, when translated using Champollion's method, spelled a phrase that chilled him. The gods remember those who wake them. He never spoke of it again. Today, the ruins still stand. The Nile still glitters like molten glass at dusk. Tourists wander through the temples of Karnak and Luxor, cameras flashing, laughter echoing off walls carved with prayers to eternity. They run their fingers across the same lines once traced by priests and pharaohs, unaware that beneath those carvings, under layers of stone, the old code still hums. Scientists have tried to measure its faint electromagnetic anomalies in the oldest tombs, unexplained vibrations in the air, but when the instruments fail, they shrugged and move on. At night, when the desert cools and the wind softens, locals say you can hear voices rising from the sand. Not ghosts' memories, whispering in a language that no longer belongs to men. A shepherd once claimed to see lights moving along the horizon, glowing symbols hovering above the dunes. His friends laughed, but he swore it was real. It looked, he said, as if the sand itself was writing. Perhaps it was, because language, once spoken, never truly dies. It becomes the breath of the earth, the pattern of tides, the rhythm of wind. And the Rosetta Stone, the key that opened the door, still sits in its glass chamber in London, watched by millions. They see only history. But those who listen carefully in the hum of the air-conditioned room swear they can hear it faintly. A low pulse, almost like a heartbeat. Maybe it's the machines. Or maybe it's the gods, still whispering through the words of men, waiting for someone to listen with reverence again. In the end, history always circles back to silence. The sands reclaim their secrets. The names fade. The monuments crumble. But beneath it all, the story continues endless, invisible, pulsing through the ages. The language of the pharaohs was never just ink on stone. It was the sound of creation remembering itself. And for a brief moment in time, through the hands of Jean-François Champollion, that memory stirred again, reminding humanity that to understand is to awaken, and to awaken is to risk being consumed by what you seek. Perhaps that is our greatest gift. Perhaps it is our curse. Because what if the act of deciphering the past is not merely discovery, but resurrection? And what if the next word we translate is the one that was never meant to be spoken at all?